Welcome to the RSP Cast. I'm Matt Waldman with the Rookie Scouting Portfolio. Today's episode is a solo cast, long-awaited solo cast, on the 2025 tight end class. It's a strong group of prospects worthy of your attention as an NFL fan, a Dynasty League GM, and in a few cases as a fantasy GM in redraft and best ball formats. Now I'm going to discuss one to two prevailing thoughts I have about the 23 tight ends that will be featured in the 2025 Rookie Scouting Portfolio pre-draft publication. It's available for pre-order right now at mattwaldman.com for April 1 download. Now, if you haven't purchased the RSP in the past, it's a PDF draft guide, covers at least 150 players at the offensive skill positions of quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. It's been available for download every April 1st, going on 20 years now. And for over a decade, I deliver a post-draft guide 1 week after the NFL draft. It's part of the subscription price of $21.95. Now, this is how I make a living. So if you enjoy the podcasts I do with Bob and Brandon, with Adam, you enjoy the YouTube channel, the work that I show on X and Blue Sky, all of that work is just simply me sharing a small amount of my background research for the publication. I go deep with the RSP, and it helps you go deep with your knowledge so that you can go deep on your league mates. Look, I was in sales a long time ago, but if what I'm sharing is low on frills, what I'm sharing is low on frills, and it's huge on substance. New readers, they're really pleasantly shocked with what they get. It's just a common thing I hear every year from new readers. They email me and tell me they just couldn't believe, they were excited about getting it from what they heard, and then when they got it, usually within a day or two or a week or two, I get an email saying they're a customer for life. Now, I'll share more detail about the RSP later in the podcast. This is what I would call the tight end B through T show, and it's going to be like my previous solo casts that I've done in recent years. I'll be sharing one or two things about these tight ends that I find notable, and I'll be sharing them in alphabetical order in terms of the tight ends. So there's no rankings really being given away here. These thoughts are going to fall into categories of praise, criticism, lingering questions, or just broader thoughts about the position. These are far from complete scouting reports. If you want the full deal, again, $21.95, mattwaldman.com will get you that. And if you like most, if you're like most of the people who give me feedback about the price, you're going to feel like you're underpaying. I get people who literally tell me I should charge more. So, yeah, I'm selling you, but it's the truth, okay? I mean, this is the one thing I do. I've been doing it for 20 years as an independent scout, and I make my living doing this book. Something's been going right. So, and I appreciate those of you who buy it every year and spread the word. Thank you very much for that, and I want to continue to provide good content. So, the big question, is 2025's tight end class a great one? Yeah, it could be a great one. But maybe we should get a cool pitcher of water, maybe a banana, a good night's sleep, and revisit that idea a little down the line. Because after studying the film and considering the past 5 years of classes, 2025 is the third consecutive draft year with a promising group. Promising. Not great. Unless you're considering this crew in a 1.5 PPR league format, none of these options should be among the first 5 selections in rookie drafts. I know that differs probably from what some people think. So for perspective, I think we'll review a few years of the RSP post-draft cheat sheets and the tight ends ranked among the top 12 options. In 2022, I ranked Trey McBride 10th in terms of overall on my post-draft board on the cheat sheet. In 2023, I had Dalton Kincaid 5th. Didn't work out great, but he was among the 12 most productive fantasy tight ends by yardage ever. So it wasn't awful, but I had him 5th. I did have Sam Laporta 11th as the dark horse candidate to maybe break Mike Ditka's record. And then I had Brock Bowers in 2024 as my 6th overall player on my cheat sheet, and the guy that I thought might break that door in. Now these post-draft rankings are for standard PPR formats, and then for 1.5 PPR formats, I tell people to adjust upward. Now, player and team fit is a huge factor. When you look at McBride in his rookie year, and what he's done since, he's Kyler Murray's binky. I think Michael Wilson and Marvin Harrison Jr. might get a little jealous about that. Kincaid, he might as well be Cal Naughton Jr. to Josh Allen's Ricky Bobby. He's never really getting a taste of that red zone glory. And I can see him asking old Ricky Bobby why he can't have a turn at that, and getting the Ricky Bobby answer. But anyway, Laporta, he got his flowers in Detroit. And then if Laporta got his flowers, I'd say Bowers is a florist. McBride's the best blocker of the group, but I would say he's definitely not anything like Rob Gronkowski or George Kittle. I would argue that Rob Gronkowski and George Kittle are figments of our imagination. As Adam Harstead and I discussed a couple years ago on our Dynasty in Theory, or our Film in Theory podcast, the receiver first options at tight end have the most sustainable NFL careers. Because the reason is that the prototype for the position is just too demanding. It stretches the bounds of reasonable athletic ability. Human beings just aren't normally built to handle the diverse range of roles. And when they do, it's just too difficult for them to remain healthy for any length of time. Now, Gronkowski has been the prototype, and there hasn't been anyone else who could handle defensive ends one-on-one as a blocker and then also beat cornerbacks one-on-one in press coverage on an intermediate route. Maybe the next closest option could have been Kellen Winslow II, but he wrecked his knee before his career could blossom. Now, the 2024 class had 6 tight ends who could have at least developed into weekly contributors, and 3 to 4 with potential to become consistent starters worthy of fantasy consideration in the next year or two. This year's class has 7 who are worthy of serious fantasy consideration as high-end contributors or weekly fantasy starters. But see, there's a complicating factor here. And that complicating factor for the 2025 class is the danger of the NFL grinding them to dust. And that's because 5 of the 7 tight ends in this year's class offer enough promise as future quote-unquote prototypes that their future teams might demand that standard of usage. They might see them as prototypes and try to make them play as prototypes. And as history has shown, there's only been a handful of unicorns who could handle the demands of the tight end prototype and deliver sustainable value. Now, spread offenses have been the rage in recent years, and last year's resurgence of the run, though, could be the beginning of maybe an offensive trend where teams start to use more H-backs and multiple tight ends in alignment because they create schematic and physical advantages against lighter defenses. If this is the intent, this class's depth will remain the headline associated with it for years to come. Now, the hope I have for the past 3 years of tight end talent entering the league is that most teams decide that they should have a division of labor and that it's the better approach than just asking one tight end to be their everything in their scheme. Now, if that proves to be the case and they divide the labor, the 2025 class is going to have a much better chance of reaching its fantasy potential. Also, there's another added difficulty with assessing the tight end position every year. It's not just the variable of scheme fit, but the learning curve involved to play at this level. Because other than quarterback, tight end has the most difficult learning curve of any position on the field. The top players of the position can block at the line and in space. They can run routes against man and zone within 20 yards of the line of scrimmage and run after the catch. The problem is that few tight ends meet all of these demands. And this is one of the reasons NFL teams usually select a steady number of the position every year and sign even more undrafted free agents. So even if a fantasy owner or draftnik doesn't have immediate interest in a tight end class, it would benefit them to have a patient mindset about the position and keep tabs on their waiver wire for guys that people just lost interest in because they had to be patient and couldn't do so. Some years back, there were fantasy analysts concluding that perhaps Travis Kelce was never as good of a prospect as draft analysts like myself and Dane Brugler touted him to be, when he was at Cincinnati. Kelce was a terrific all-around option, but the learning curve coupled with the advanced demands of the position, sometimes takes time, especially if you're in an offense like Andy Reid's offense. So, when we talk about grading tight end play, the RSP does it a little different than many media outlets that model the NFL as a whole. Many NFL teams place a higher weight on blocking than receiving, so the RSP's evaluation system is aligned closer to that valuation of the position that Bill Belichick really started. Now, while the ideal is that the tight ends possess a great acumen with both skill sets, most prospects aren't that well balanced. So, again, while the RSP is a football publication, it also caters to fantasy football. So as a result, it's always shaped its grading scale to value pass catchers at the position who can block ahead of blockers who can catch. So 2 years ago, I thought Dalton Kincaid had the best chance to break Mike Ditka's rookie production record. It didn't happen, though. He did get on the top 12 list. And then I said if it wasn't Kincaid, I believed Sam Laporta would have the best season of the rookies based on skill set and good fit. And last year, I wrote in this publication that if Laporta had knocked on Ditka's door in terms of the record that he held in terms of production as a rookie tight end, Brock Bowers was going to break it down. And, these player stories, as well as other past cases, illustrate that, really opportunity precedes talent when it comes to production. But a guy like Bowers is the exception that proves the rule because, look, he was the lead player in a Raiders offense that really didn't have steady quarterback play. Bowers was that way. Then you look at Malik Neighbors at receiver. And again, this kind of tells you that, that oftentimes if you're talented and in the passing game, you don't have to have a great quarterback to produce. Now, as great as Bowers was last year, we should honor the fact that Ditka's output took 3 fewer games, and he was in a far more physical era of football where they could mug you at the line of scrimmage and down the field. So, kudos to Bowers for sure. But keep good thoughts about Ditka and what he did there. All right, so this year, 2025's class, Colston Loveland and Mason Taylor, in my eyes, are the most pro-ready to handle that, quote, prototypical role if asked to. Still, I think they have a much higher likelihood of success if the schemes that they go to focus on their receiving work as H-backs instead of inline blockers, and I think they probably will. Harold Fannin Jr., Elijah Arroyo, Tyler Warren, Gunnar Helm, they all have skills where a team could maximize their receiving ability and minimize their blocking responsibilities that could help them get rookie production. I would add that Thomas Fidone could probably handle extended inline work, but it might deflate his receiving upside. And if a team just wants a blocker, just a dude who's, hard-nosed, technically sound, physical blocker, a 6th offensive lineman, Georgia Tech's Jackson Hawes may be near the bottom of the RSP's board, but he's the best inline blocker of this group. So, as a fantasy guy, if you're as a fantasy GM, if your league awards 1.5 PPR for tight ends, the top 5 talents on the RSP's board are going to be worth probably top 15 picks. And then the next 4 on my board could be worth taking in the bottom third of the top 45. That's, again, 1.5 PPR. So let's go through some of my thoughts on them individually from B to T. Starting with B, we got Bryson Nesbitt of North Carolina. Nesbitt's faster than his workout performance at the NFL Combine, and he's a nimble athlete with the ball in his hands. He's technically skilled with releases against coverage, and I think he has potential value as a man-to-man receiver in a big slot role or matched up with less athletic defenders on the perimeter. The ultimate problem for me with Nesbitt is that he's athletic enough to be on a team, but he lacks a skill in his game that elevates his play to a starting role. He's neither big nor fast enough to thrive as a primary weapon at tight end, and some teams may just prefer one of their receivers play the big slot role because they offer as much there and more on the outside. All right. C.J. Dipre of Alabama, formerly of Maryland. While he doesn't beat defensive backs downfield when they play man-to-man coverage on him, he can wind up the scene against linebackers and some safeties. And when he does, what you want to see is him develop better positioning and attack with his hands. He must develop a pullback when he high points the ball in contested scenarios so that he doesn't have the ball pulled away from him. I've seen him drop accurate targets that he otherwise would have caught if he had just protected the ball quicker, and that's something that he's going to have to work at. Caden Priestcorn. Now, let me tell you this. When you watch him, he's fun. He's a fun watch sometimes because if the rest of his game looked as good as it does when he plucks the ball with one hand on a variety of targets, he'd be a really compelling NFL prospect. But as it stands right now, Priestcorn's releases, his routes, and his blocking need a lot of work. He's a linear mover, someone that does really well in a straight line, but when you ask him to move outside of his frame and make very sharp changes of direction and bend deeply, that's not his thing, and that can be difficult. And we're going to talk a little bit more about linear movers in this show. He will intrigue on highlights as a pass catcher. So if you hear people touting him, they probably saw the highlights where he's making some really impressive plays with his hands. Michigan's Colston Loveland. Loveland's one of the best talents among the skill positions in this class, if you ask me. So yeah, he's my number one tight end in this class. At the same time, he's also one of those talents that might anchor him to the line of scrimmage more often than, say, Brock Bowers, whose game as a blocker just isn't as deep as Loveland's. Now, as a receiver, I like Loveland that he can snap his turns on breaks inside or outside. He punches the boundary arm to generate much of that suddenness on the turn. That's good technique. And that's what you want to see, especially with guys who are working underneath routes or tight coverage against faster opponents. Because you want to be able to snap turns. The quicker you can turn, the quicker you're ready for the ball, and the more separation you get as a defender overruns the route or overruns the break. So Loveland, very good at snapping turns, and I don't see that a lot with young tight ends or even young receivers for that matter. You only get like a handful of them every year that seem to do that. So Elijah Arroyo, University of Miami. Skilled pass catcher. He makes successful athletic adjustments to targets that the NFL would expect from a tight end who can win at the boundary. And then also he wins with routes where he's thrown open. I think for Arroyo, the way he's going to be able to fulfill his promise, he's going to have to work on addressing specific target locations where he just hasn't formulated a plan of attack that uses uniform hand position. There's just these throws in games where it's clear that Arroyo doesn't have an ingrained reaction to where he should place his hands for a sound attack of the football when throws are, high and behind, low and into his body, depending on where his break is. And it's like his hands just short circuit because he hasn't practiced those awkward positions. So what ends up happening when he runs these routes and he has to turn against his grain to catch it, it catches him by surprise. So he's going to have to spend time breaking down where his attack loses uniformity with his hands and just drill that correct uniformity for each area and do it with, dedication on a daily level. And if he does, I think he can ingrain those reactions into his game to the point that he becomes a top pass catcher. It might take a season or two, but if he were to work on that every day and make it just muscle memory, he'd be much better at reacting to the speed of instinct with a technically sound attack in situations where you would expect him to make those plays because he should be a top-level talent. Gavin Bartholomew of Pitt. Now, I like Bartholomew because he's a good route runner, and one of the things that he does well is setting up coverage, especially against zone or even man. He has that stair-step technique where you basically use your stem in one direction and then flatten it out as if you're trying to challenge the vertical the vertical seam, and then you break in another direction. And he does that well. He has a subtle inset against off coverage playing outside of him, which means that Bartholomew sells the inside break at the top of his stem, where he looks in, he turns his shoulders, he can turn his hips, and he gives a really good indication that he's about to break inside before breaking outside. And he does this well. The way that you want to do these types of things, the stair steps, the insets, the peaks to the outside where you're trying to sell the fade, but actually you're breaking inside. The way to do that is to attack the leverage of the defender in the direction of that fake, because you're using a fake that's reinforcing where that defender is before you break in the opposite direction. And what you want to do is you want to attack that leverage with really good speed, because if you're attacking at high speed, then you don't need to be as dramatic with your movements. You can be a little bit more subtle, and it makes everything believable. And so Gavin Bartholomew does that really well. And I think that he's someone that, he gets open. The big thing is, can he start to rein in some sloppiness with his attack of the ball when he has to extend his arms away from his frame? When he has to make extreme athletic adjustments, high or low, his hands tend to get wide rather than him extending with his hands together. If he can extend with his hands together, this guy could be a very intriguing prospect with more upside than you think. Gunnar Helm. Now, the Texas product, he's got enough acceleration and short area quickness to earn separation with man-to-man routes, and he can challenge zone defenders up the seam, but he just lacks the explosion to pull away from a secondary. I think he'd flip the field, and I've seen him do that, but more times than not, he's not going to break away to the end zone or pull away from defensive backs or even a lot of linebackers. Now, he's learned some techniques with stems. That's the part of the route after the release and before the break. He's learned some techniques with these stems to manipulate defenders facing him in zone coverage. But his lack of artistry with pacing just makes the techniques too predictable. As a good route runners play with rhythm. You kind of establish a rhythm, you bait the defender into that rhythm, and then you start to make little changes to that rhythm to make them uncomfortable and throw them off, so that they can't really predict what's going to happen next, and they may second guess things. So you keep them off balance that way. And Helm needs to learn that. If he can do that, he could take his routes to another level. Harold Fannin Jr. of Bowling Green. Let me tell you this. Fannin and Sam Laporta are both former wide receivers who transitioned to the position in college. And pre-draft, you look at them, they're essentially the same height and weight. Fannin delivered a 4.39 second 20-yard shuttle and a 6.9 second three-cone drill. Laporta had a 4.25 20-yard shuttle compared to Fannin's 4.39. And then he had a 6.9 second three-cone drill compared to Fannin's 6.97. So 6.91 versus 6.97. And Laporta's vertical leap was 35 inches, which was just one more inch than Fannin's. So when I looked at that and compared it to the standard of how I group workout data of that type, Laporta and Fannin are in the same tiers of performance for each drill that I mentioned. The greatest difference is the 40-yard dash, and Laporta's 4.59 second 40-yard performance is 1/100th of a second inside the elite tier. So he's just inside the elite tier in terms of speed. Now Fannin's 4.71 second 40-yard performance is just 1/100th of a second outside the starter tier. Now you'd say, well, that's a big difference, but really it's a big difference if you're thinking faster is better. But if you're talking about good enough to see the field, well, the starter tier in my book is one tier above the standard of what's good enough to see the field. The committee tier is what's good enough to see the field as a starter, or at least playing to starter ability, where you can play to your strengths and they can scheme around you. starter tier is they don't really have to do as much scheming around you. You can operate that offense as is, if I'm going to give it a simplistic definition. And so if Fannin is only 1/100th of a second outside the starter tier, you can essentially say he's there, because on any given run, he should probably be in that tier. Now, what's funny is we spent a lot of time on a 40-yard dash, and so did fans. That shut down a lot of the pre-draft love for Fannin in the public eye. But I don't think it should, because when reviewing the routes Fannin ran at Bowling Green versus the routes Laporta ran as a rookie in Detroit, the 40-yard dash results really don't matter much, if at all. Now, I share a lot of those routes in the RSP chapter that you'll find at www.mattwaldman.com when it's available for download in April. But Fannin's, I'll skip along and say Fannin's career max speed at Bowling Green was 20.3 miles per hour. And his average speed for his fastest moments were between 19 and 19.5 miles per hour. Laporta's career max speed was almost a mile an hour higher at 21.1. And his average speed, top speed for his fastest moments was about a tier higher, 19.6 miles per hour to 20 miles per hour, compared to Fannin's 19 to 19.5. But still, it's a mistake to look at Fannin's speed numbers and say that those numbers are bad because they don't match up exactly with Laporta's. I'd say it's correct to look at Fannin's data and know that his on-field measured speed meets the standard for NFL starters at the position, and his initial acceleration and change of direction quickness exceed the standards for NFL starters. So you compare a player's data to the baseline standards, and then you consider whether this data matches his style of play, and also whether it matches the demands that the game will place on him. A good example of that where people got all up in arms and missed the overall point of this was Dalvin Cook, the running back from Minnesota or Florida State. Dalvin Cook's metrics fell below baseline standards in certain areas, but when you look at his game, his curvilinear style of movement didn't match any of the drills that measured how fast a player cuts or changes direction. Think about that. Would you grade a pastry chef on how well he cooks a steak just because he and a regular chef both work in a kitchen with a lot of the same tools? No, of course not. And an NFL offense in that sense is a restaurant. What they choose to serve is up to them. So although Laporta's vertical routes led to huge games as a rookie, and that's going to remain, emblazoned in the minds of fantasy GMs for years, the real deal is that the success of Laporta's game doesn't hinge on speed. Most of his vertical wins came on long developing play action routes against zone and broken zones. Routes Fannin could have easily won in the same scenarios. So just something to keep in mind. Speaking of conventional thinking and herd speak and why that shouldn't be on your mind, we know that it's not on the minds of what you see in the Rookie Scouting Portfolio pre-draft or post-draft publication. Now it's in its 20th year. The RSP is the goods. For $21.95, you're going to get the most comprehensive look at skill positions, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. It's the most comprehensive look you're going to see available in the general public. And what you get for download on April 1st is a PDF. It's fully bookmarked, easy to navigate, and it contains information that my subscribers have learned is evergreen and even more valuable than the post-draft, which is usually in high demand by the newest folks. Rankings and cheat sheet and pros formats are things that you're going to see. You're going to get detailed profiles breaking down all the criteria I used to scout each position, a guide through, and the RSP guides you through my defined and weighted criteria so that you gain an entertaining understanding of my evaluation process and how the pieces make the whole of each scouting report. You're going to get analysis with recent draft trends at each position, what I think is changing with how the league assesses these positions, a range of stylistic comparisons for each prospect. You're going to get a minimum of 150 prospects pre-draft. Right now I know I'm over 160. Rankings from my past 3 draft classes are updated multiple times during the season, and you get one of them in the pre-draft guide. And the post-draft guide, that's the part of the purchase that is available no later than a week after the draft. And it's a great fantasy tool because it's rooted in the football scouting I did in the pre-draft publication, but it gives you all the fantasy goods that you want. ADP tracking from multiple leagues, updated rankings, and a tiered cheat sheet with sweet spot values between my valuation of the player post-draft and what his post-draft ADP is. So, for example, if I liked Ladd McConkey a lot, and I would talk about, I would show you what his ADP was and where I had his value, and the difference between that would tell you where you could draft him and still extract the most value without heightening your chances of being in severe danger of missing out on him. So it's a really good tool in that fashion. I analyze the fit with these players with their teams, looking at their contracts, looking at the depth charts, analyzing some of the players on those depth charts as well. Basically also points out to you which veterans have a year or two left on their deals and how I see their playing time sorted out relative to the incoming rookies and free agents. And you're also going to get a monthly newsletter with scouting reports and analysis of current and future prospects. You can just go to www.mattwaldman.com. All right, back to this show. Jackson Hawes, Georgia Tech, by way of Yale, with man-over-me assignments. These are blocking assignments where it's the man directly in front of you. Hawes is a skilled striker. He's got good footwork and leverage. He pushes defensive ends off their spots and controls interactions long enough to play for plays to work as designed. And I'm talking about in the ACC, not at Yale. Okay. Hawes uses his one-arm technique efficiently to counter defenders when they try to redirect on him. And when he locks his hand into defenders, he's difficult to shake at the line of scrimmage. It's because he has a good center of gravity with his stance, his strength, and his footwork. Now, as a ball carrier, Hawes spins off contact with tight motion. He gets his feet through wraps. He kicks his heels towards his backside, which a lot of good running backs do. So he can work over contact and through it. And he only needs a couple of steps to transition downhill from a perimeter approach when he's working to the far side of the field with the ball in his hand. So there's some agility there. There's some control with change of direction there. And we know that I think he's the best blocker in this class, and I don't think I'm alone in that respect. He's one of the most intriguing players from a scouting perspective of the skill players in this class. Jake Briningstool of Clemson. Because of the highs that I've seen with him as a pass catcher, it wouldn't shock me one bit if he emerges as the best ball winner in this tight end class. But at the same time, there's enough holding Briningstool back that he could just fail outright to emerge and get stuck in his own head when it comes to facing difficult targets. So I think overall the baseline skills for Briningstool are good enough for him to make teams and contribute, but the variance with his pass catching could prove too great for a team to rely on him as anything more than a tight end 2 or playable tight end 3 in their rotation. Fascinating player. Texas Tech, Jalen Conyers by way of Arizona State. Conyers has 4 areas where I think he could clean up his game. His release footwork, developing hard breaks with good weight drop against man-to-man coverage so that he can really separate quickly, limiting his elapses with attacking the football. He has some issues with how he gets his hands in position to win the ball, and it leads to drops. And then also curtailing his overextensions as a blocker. When you overextend as a blocker, the defenders can dictate the action from that point forward because you don't see what you're hitting, you're off balance. You're not in a position to be able to dictate anything, and you basically are giving up the chain of events to the defender. Now, if Conyers can improve 2 to 3 of these areas, I think he could have similar promise as a lot of the tight ends in the second tier of my rankings. So you can see he's not in the second tier. Conyers may be near the bottom of the third tier right now. That's where he is. but he has probably the most realistic path to climb into the second tier among those third tier tight ends, and that means he could have a meaningful career with legitimate receiving production. So if he could perform maybe, just 2 to 3 of those areas, that could happen. If he can improve all 4 of these areas, he might become a weekly starter a starter with weekly statistical value in the box score and a fantasy factor. South Carolina's Josh Simon, he's a speedy H-back, skilled after the catch, and he does his best work as an outlet player in the flats and the numbers. He's good in off-play action and in screens and checkdowns, and that's because he's a patient and decisive runner who gets his feet and knees high enough to work over low shots from pursuit. I think he could become a competent route runner against zone and man-to-man coverage, but Simon's just going to have to work on his breaks because that's where he just kind of has things kind of break down. And I'd also say that he can catch the ball at a variety of angles, but his technique has too many leaks to say he's reliable at catching the ball at a variety of angles. Kaleki Latu of Washington. He's a good striker as a blocker, and he earns optimal position in line. And it looks like he could add another 15 to 20 pounds of muscle to his frame. And if he does, I think there's potential for him to develop into a contributor in short yardage scenarios. As a receiver, he's got hand strength. He can attack the ball with overhand technique away from his frame against tight coverage at his back. And deal with defenders swatting at the ball after he makes the initial catch. It's hard to knock the ball loose from his hands. Luke Lachey of Iowa. I would describe Lachey as, say, like a pentagon or an octagon entering a league where the 2 prototypical roles at the tight end position are circles and squares. And what I mean by that is that Lachey's got build-up speed, but his acceleration and quickness aren't quite enough for him to earn the runway necessary to reach that top gear, unless he's on a slow developing topic. But at the other end of the spectrum, he has a lot of effective skills as a blocker, except he's not at the size where he's going to match up well against NFL caliber edge defenders on his own. So, when you look at Lachey, he's got disparate skills. Teams want tight ends who have a certain group of skills from column A, like, say, inline options have column A, and then they hope that maybe they can get some bonus skills from column B, which is the receiving heavy option, or you could switch the other way around. But the problem is that it's hard to find a fit for a tight end who has some of column A and some column B, but not enough of either column. And this is where I think Lachey's grade is probably higher than on my list than the reality of how the NFL is going to assess him. All right, Mason Taylor, LSU. Son of Jason Taylor, the former Pro Bowl level defensive end for the Miami Dolphins for many, many years. Great pass rusher. Mason Taylor's son's smooth, shows up in every facet of his game. As a blocker, he's got a knack for hooking and turning his assignments on the perimeter. He's good with his hands at the line of scrimmage. He can counter the opponent's counter in the run game and earn a good angle to force the defender away from the rushing lane. And he's light-footed in pass protection. It helps him slide laterally to wall off opponents. Now, as a route runner, Taylor's got a solid grasp of Relee's footwork and upper body counters to work past defenders and get into his patterns quickly. And he drops his weight effectively into specific breaks and has flat speed turns for in and out breaking routes. Now, none of this is to say that Taylor is just all finesse. He's definitely got physicality to his game, too. He has good strikes at the line of scrimmage as a blocker. He can uppercut and then roll through his hips to generate force while establishing and sustaining control over his opponents. When you roll through your hips like that, when you strike with an uppercut, it pushes the defender upward as opposed to as much as it, instead of strictly backward. And when you can get the defender to basically pushing him upward and off his feet, it allows you to stay tight to the defender, but also take away his control brief enough so that you establish control and dictating the chain of events to follow. And Taylor does that well. Taylor also takes hard shots at the catch point and earns the ball. and he can win collisions with corners, safeties, linebackers, and maintain possession of the ball. Notre Dame's Mitchell Evans. Evans has acceleration, and he's got reasonable speed for his size. He can get open against zone coverage and help out at the line of scrimmage, but he clap attacks too many targets, and he has difficulty changing direction in open space when you're talking about his work with route running, with blocking, and carrying the ball. All right, Maliki Matavao. He is from UCLA. He's a technically sound route runner at this stage of his development, and I think he could grow into a really skilled zone receiver who manipulates off-coverage defenders before he settles into open space or working across the field. After the catch, when you look at him coming off the bus or working downfield, he looks like an imposing runner, but he goes down easily. I mean, even when smaller defenders wrap him high, which is something that, he should be able to carry this guy for a long ride, he goes down easily. So unless Matavao is playing through, say, a difficult injury that we don't know about, his work as a ball carrier right now is disappointing for his size. Oronde Gadsden, the second, Syracuse, another son of a former Dolphin, Oronde Gadsden Sr., a former wide receiver. Gadsden is a former wide receiver switching to tight end. He's got a small repertoire, though, as a route runner, and the moves and techniques and concepts he has just isn't very expansive, and it restricts him to really being mostly effective in zone coverage. And I feel like, from what I've seen, he's just got zero craft with man-to-man coverage. He's got to develop it. At the catch point, Gadsden wins the ball against tight coverage and attacks the ball early, but he does have lapses with clap attacking the ball when he high points. Good thing is that he can take hits to earn the football. He's a guy that mostly is going to, have use in space. Auburn's Rivaldo Fairweather by way of Florida International, FIU. Fairweather's a good athlete. He's got speed to stretch zones and beat man-to-man coverage, but he's got to develop some artistry with his footwork and pacing when releasing from the line and when he's using setups during his stems so that he can actually become a legitimate threat against man coverage. Fairweather's a good pass tracker, and he has a lot of tools to win against tight coverage. He just has to improve his grip strength, his focus, and his retraction of the football. If he can do that, I think he'll be, he could be a dynamic pass catcher. He also has lapses with attacking with uniform position or using the ideal attack type for the trajectory. So, the hands are the big issue with him for him to improve upon. Oregon's Terrence Ferguson. He's earning a lot of love for his speed and vertical leaping ability. At the same time, he's a linear athlete. And most of football isn't played in straight lines. So, if you get Ferguson in a well-blocked screen or out in space and you allow him to rumble up to full speed in a straight line, he's going to give you chunk plays. And if you work him on, up the seam on well-devised play-action passes, he can track the ball over his shoulder or have time to fully turn to the ball and make the catch. Even back shoulder plays are reasonable for him. But his short area quickness and his bend aren't on par with his linear ability. So he's at a disadvantage for a lot of baseline skills that are required of tight ends, such as winning releases against tight coverage at the line or setting up tight man-to-man coverage during his stems, setting up routes with during his stems against tight man-to-man coverage, and then winning breaks against man-to-man and making defenders miss in the open field and redirecting his position against defenders as a run blocker. It's not that he can't do all of those things, but it's more troublesome and it's more limiting. He's limited in what he can do in each of these areas. And these are a lot of the core skills required of tight ends in the NFL. So he's going to have to be great at what he does and competent at what's difficult for a linear athlete to perform. And right now he's not real competent at a lot of things that a tight end has to perform that are non-linear activities. Nebraska's Thomas Fidone. Fidone's tape's filled with him catching targets at every angle and window. And what impressed me more about Fidone than his pass catching were his routes. He's not going to have a packed toolbox of tools for selling a stem, to set up a break, but he executes the handful of ways he knows at a high level. And they're interchangeable skills with a variety of his routes. I think his setups have the right amount of emphasis to sell each movement. His breaks are clean and crisp. He drops his weight well. He makes flat turns. There's snap to his turns. I mean, again, that's something you don't usually see with NFL prospects who run routes until, say, their third or fourth year in the league, if ever. Tyler Neville, former Harvard player at Virginia. He's a badass. Maybe not like for fantasy leagues. Maybe not necessarily on an NFL field, though I think he's going to have moments of badassery there. But go look up his story. Go look up his medical history. And you'll know that this dude was a badass. But he's going to show his badassery as a special teamer, probably more often than as an offensive weapon. But I wouldn't put it past Neville if he develops into a competent backup who can serve as a stopgap H-back for a team, and they use him in this role. He catches the ball well. He wins targets that require some athletic adjustments, and he earns position well against tight coverage to win the ball. He can take contact to win a play. He's patient. He's determined and rugged after the catch. He's going to move the chains for you, and he's a smart decision maker. He can create against unblocked defenders within the realm of his athletic gifts. Interesting player. Now we're at the end, and that's Iowa's Tyler Warren. As a blocker, Warren's got some work to do. He overextends too much. He telegraphs his intentions. He allows defenders to dictate the action. And he doesn't use his hands nearly enough in situations where a blocker in the NFL can't throw haymakers with his body. Warren tries to overwhelm you with his physicality, but he's got to learn to punch and keep his pads up so he can dictate the action, use good leverage, and create a chain of sound techniques that lead to the next sound technique. And if he can stack these sound techniques and skills together, he's going to create a good process that leads to more good results than bad. Right now, Warren's just overwhelming guys with his size and aggression. Works on Saturdays. It's a lot less consistent on Sundays. If Warren earns, say, a Tucker Kraft type of role early in a scheme, outlet receiver, off play action, up the seams, he could probably get early success. That'll become a bigger part of the game plan by the year's end or in year two. But I think if he's asked to do more against man-to-man coverage and as a blocker, it might take him a little longer. Until then, I think Warren's process at the catch point is good enough that another path to early success for him would be as a red zone specialist in contested catch situations. And you could use him as a runner. You could use him as a trick play option because he's a good quarterback in those scenarios inside the 5. Well, that's it, folks. You can get your rookie scouting portfolio. Pre-order it. MattWaldman.com. $21.95. And you get the pre-draft and post-draft. I also do Dynasty rankings and projections, a full set of Dynasty rankings for every player, every team. That's a separate service available for $24.95. Same site, MattWaldman.com. And, thank you again. I'm beat. It's about midnight here, just before midnight on St. Patrick's Day here. And just finished the wide receiver section. Going to start running backs this week. You'll probably get a wide receiver podcast out of me within the next week and a half, hopefully, as well. Take care.